Good morning, afternoon, or evening. My name is Tasha DiCoio, and this presentation is for my EDU 1107 Foundations of Education class. We will be learning about the behavioral and social factors of learning with a focus on how conditioned learning can benefit us as teachers in the classroom. If the name Pavlov rings a bell, you're already halfway there. Are people sheep? Do you think so? Watch the following video before you make up your mind.
To answer that question, we set up a hidden camera experiment to see if this woman would stand up at the sound of this tone, simply because everyone else is. You might be thinking you'd never go along with this. Or would you? After just 3 beats, and without knowing why she's doing it, this woman is now conforming perfectly to the group. But what happens if we take the group away?
Elaine, please.
Okay, now she's alone. The crowd is gone and nobody is watching her, except our hidden cameras. What do you think she'll do? She's now conforming to the rules of the group without them even being there. Now, watch what happens when we introduce another outsider who doesn't know the rules.
Have a seat and they'll be out in just a couple minutes. Thanks so much. Everybody was doing it, so I thought I was supposed to.
Think she'll teach the new guy what to do? We kept the cameras rolling as more unsuspecting patients arrived. And slowly but surely, what began as a random rule for this woman has now become the social norm for everyone in this waiting room. Here to explain what's going on in their brains is Jonah Berger of the University of Pennsylvania.
This sort of internalized form of herd behavior is part of what we call social learning. Starting at a very early age, when we see members of our group perform a task, our brains literally reward us for following in their footsteps.
When I saw everybody stand up, I felt like I needed to join them. Otherwise, I'm excluded. Once I decided to go with it, then I felt much more comfortable.
Conformity is how we become socialized, but it can also cause us to develop bad habits or repeat past wrongs.
And it's why even this rebel, who wasn't standing for any of this nonsense, eventually joined the ranks. And the only thing more shocking than seeing how easily conformity affects the way you act is that similar forces are subconsciously shaping the way you think right now.
So, after viewing the video, you can see how easily people can be manipulated into changing their behavior, even when they don't fully understand why. Many people have theorized that human beings begin life as a blank slate, just waiting to be filled with knowledge and wisdom. It is the job of society to provide those answers. This has been the basis of many schools of thought and the motivation behind many instructional institutions. It is the idea that people only have wrong beliefs because they don't know better or they have been taught wrong. With that in mind, answer the following questions. How much of what you are taught do you believe? How do you decide what is right and wrong? How hard is it to change what you believe? And how much of what you believe is based on feelings? The behaviorist movement began in 1913, when John Watson wrote an article entitled "Psychology as the Behaviorist Views It." He determined a number of underlying assumptions for methodology and behavioral analysis that have become the core of behaviorism. First, all behavior is learned from the environment. Second, psychology should be seen as a science. Third, behaviorism is primarily concerned with observable behavior as opposed to internal events like thinking and emotion. Fourth, there is little difference between the learning that takes place in humans and that in other animals. And last, behavior is the result of stimulus and response. We will look more closely at each of these underlying assumptions for behavioral analysis and consider how they may apply within the classroom setting. The first underlying assumption is that all behavior is learned from the environment. Behaviorism emphasizes the role of environmental factors in influencing behavior to the near exclusion of innate or inherited factors. We learn new behavior through classical conditioning or operant conditioning, which is collectively known as learning theory. Therefore, when born, our mind is a tabula rasa, or blank slate. As a quick assignment, if you were given the game Pac-Man and told no rules, could you figure out the game through trial and error? What if someone told you that the goal was to see how long you could draw out the level? Would you change the way you play to earn their praise? The second underlying assumption is that psychology should be seen as a science. Theories need to be supported by empirical data obtained through careful and controlled observation and measurement of behavior. Watson stated that psychology, as a behaviorist views it, is a purely objective environmental branch of natural science. Its theoretical goal is prediction and control. The components of a theory should be as simple as possible. Behaviorists propose the use of operational definitions or defining variables in terms of observable, measurable events. As a quick assignment, do you agree that behavior can be controlled? To what extent? What factors might make behavior more difficult to control, even with repeated conditioning? The third underlying assumption is that behaviorism is primarily concerned with observable behavior, as opposed to the internal events like thinking and emotion. While behaviorists often accept the existence of thoughts and emotions, they prefer not to study them. Only observable external behavior can be objectively and scientifically measured. Therefore, internal events like thinking should either be explained through behavioral terms or simply eliminated altogether. As a quick assignment, why do you think thoughts and emotions cannot be quantitatively studied? Do you think behaviorists are right to take them out of their experiments? The fourth underlying assumption is that there is little difference between the learning that takes place in humans and that in other animals. This is not to say that they have the same thought process, but rather that there is no fundamental difference measurably between human and animal behavior. Because of this, research can be carried out on animals as well as humans with the same results. This is known as comparative psychology. With this belief system, Rats and pigeons became the primary source of data for behaviorists, since their environments could be easily controlled. We do see many scientists using other animals, such as monkeys or dogs, in their experiments. The choice in animal, however, tends to be related to ease of obtaining them or coincidence, as we will see later with Pavlov's experiments on dog salivation. As a quick assignment, do you agree that human behavior and animal behavior are fundamentally the same? In what way are they similar? In what ways might they be different? The final underlying assumption is the one that is the most important when trying to condition behavior. All behaviors, even those considered complex, may be reduced to a basic stimulus-response association. Watson said that the purpose of psychology is to predict, given the stimulus, what reaction will take place, or, given the reaction, state what the situation or stimulus is that has caused the reaction. As a quick assignment, can you think of any behaviors that might take place without an external stimulus? How might this be an important factor when considering consequences for behavior in the classroom? Which brings us to Pavlov. Pavlov. Does it ring a bell? Probably the most famous experiment about conditioned or learned behavior is from a Russian scientist named Pavlov. It was his experiments that led to behaviorists like Watson to create their theories. He performed an experiment to see if he could get his dogs to drool at the ring of a bell rather than when they saw or smelled food. Sounds cute, right? Wrong. Watch the following video clip to see what exactly his experiments entailed.
Around the turn of the century, the great Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov made an accidental discovery that was to become a landmark in the field of learning. Pavlov was studying the salivation reflex in dogs as part of his research on digestion. He noticed that after the dogs had been brought to the laboratory many times, they would start to salivate even before food was given. What had altered the dog's inborn salivation reflex? Pavlov was fascinated and changed the direction of his research to focus on what he called conditional reflexes. Pavlov knew that placing food in the dog's mouth naturally caused salivation. The unconditioned stimulus food produced the unconditioned response, salivation. Through a series of ingenious experiments, he found that if a new and unrelated stimulus, like a bell, was repeatedly sounded before the food was given, the dogs would learn to salivate when they heard the bell, even when no food followed. The conditioned stimulus, the bell, produced the conditioned response, salivation. Moreover, almost any type of stimulus when paired with food could produce salivation. This process of learning by association became known as classical conditioning.
Pavlov's contribution in introducing the concept of classical conditioning was to bring to us an understanding of how we learn by association, how we learn that one thing leads to another. This has been particularly important in helping us understand how certain autonomic or automatic physiological responses come to occur in new situations in which they didn't normally occur. One practical application of classical conditioning is the work of Dr. John Garcia, who confronted the problem of coyotes who would attack farmers' livestock.
Destroying these predators upsets the delicate ecological balance. But how else could these animals be controlled? Psychologists John Garcia and Carl Gustavusson developed a new strategy based on the concepts of classical conditioning. Lamb meat is laced with lithium chloride, a chemical that produces nausea when eaten. The treated meat is then wrapped in sheep hide and put out as bait near grazing flocks. When the coyotes eat the bait, they immediately become sick and vomit. The predators quickly learn to associate sheep with nausea and actively avoid the animals. More and more, ranchers are using this approach to protect their flocks while preserving the delicate ecology of the rangelands.
So, animal cruelty aside, so what? How does classical conditioning, like Pavlov's experiments, relate to real life? In society, we usually call it peer pressure. People often conform to certain beliefs, attitudes, and actions merely because it is expected of them. Not conforming creates a sense of exclusion and discomfort. In the classroom, our students may not be dogs, but they do like treats. They respond to positive and negative consequences, and they learn from what we say and what we do. Consider this. How do you condition your students? How do students respond to routines? How can conditioning help behavior in your classroom? One solid example of social conditioning can be seen whenever someone learning about the Holocaust says, "I would never have stood by and watched that." But the fact is, hundreds of thousands of people did just that. How? They were conditioned to accept the dictates of authority. It is something we all do to some extent. Before conditioning, the government sanctioned violence against Jews and other minorities. People either listened to authority or they didn't. Then the government began to call the people who responded with violence patriots and encouraged violence against those who didn't conform, calling them traitors. Afterwards, people simply chose to conform in order to protect themselves and their families. As a result, hundreds of thousands of people ignore the Holocaust. But what does this look like in the classroom? One method often used by teachers works as follows. Before conditioning, the teacher asks students to be quiet and then claps 3 times. The students either choose to be quiet or they do not. During conditioning, the teacher claps 3 times and then asks the students to be quiet. This time, nearly all the students get quiet, as they saw the expected behavior from the first example. After conditioning, all the teacher needs to do is clap her hands 3 times and students will automatically begin to quiet, having associated the clapping with her request for silence. This is an effective tool to help teachers with classroom management. And it is only the beginning. Positive versus negative conditioning. It inevitably comes up whenever someone says the word discipline. Is discipline necessarily a punishment? When students misbehave, what do? We want them to stop the behavior, but do they need to be punished? All of the following are common techniques used in classrooms. On the positive side, teachers can offer praise, candy, and extra privileges, like free time or taking off their shoes. On the negative side, teachers often take away privileges, give referrals, or assign detention. Depending on the technique, students are responding with a desire to receive something positive or avoid something negative. While all of these techniques can produce a desired result and are a form of classical conditioning, which ones do you think will be the most effective in your classroom? Thank you for listening, and I look forward to your comments about what you learned of social and behavioral learning, with Pavlov as a classical conditioning example, and how it can help you facilitate learning in your own classrooms.